This took place during a camping trip with my girlfriend Alicia, my best friend Rodney, and his girlfriend Amanda. My dad had told me about what he said was the perfect camping spot beside a large lake, completely surrounded by thick forest. There was a trail that started from a nearby parking area and led directly to the water. His directions were clear and simple, and reaching the lake was actually pretty easy. We arrived as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in a deep orange glow. The lake felt peaceful, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees was calming. We set up our tents while there was still a faint orange color left in the sky, although the woods themselves had already grown very dark. The lake reflected that orange light across its still surface. The air was warm, and Amanda suggested we all go for a swim. I was fairly open to the idea, especially since my dad mentioned the lake would be great for swimming. That was why we had all brought towels. The girls were clearly more excited about it than Rodney and I were. Both of them stripped down to their underwear and stepped into the lake, laughing and saying the water was actually warm. I told them I would join them after getting the campfire started, since we had already collected some wood. Getting the fire going turned out to be harder than expected, because I just could not get the wood to light. I am definitely not experienced with this kind of thing. Rodney stepped in to help, and while I watched him work on the fire, one of the girls suddenly began screaming and thrashing around in the water. Amanda looked just as shocked as Rodney and I did. Then Alicia disappeared beneath the surface for a few seconds, and Amanda screamed that she was drowning. I tore off my shirt and sprinted into the lake as fast as I could. When I reached her, the water was only about waist deep. I could see her arms still flailing above the surface, splashing wildly, and I lifted her upright. I shouted, asking what had happened. She did not respond right away, and instead ran toward the campsite, gasping for air. About halfway there, she turned around and yelled for us to get out of the water. Amanda and I exchanged a look and followed her warning. As I started moving toward shore, something powerful wrapped around my ankle and tried to drag me down. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain slice into my ankle at the same time. Panicking, I yelled and kicked violently with my free leg until whatever it was finally let go. When we reached the campsite, Alicia was already sitting on a cooler, pressing her hand against a visible injury on her ankle. I sat on another cooler and checked my own leg. There was a small but deep cut on the side of my ankle, and blood was flowing freely. I asked Rodney to grab bandages from the first aid kit in the tent. After cleaning and covering the wounds, we finally started to calm down. Once the shock wore off, all we could think about was what had actually grabbed us in the water. I suggested it might have been an eel. Rodney wondered out loud whether eels even lived in lakes like that. Alicia said whatever grabbed her did not feel like an eel or even a fish. She said it felt more like a claw. Hearing her say that sent chills through me, because I understood what she meant, but it made no sense at all. Still, we stayed where we were, figuring whatever attacked us was in the water, and we were safely on land. By then, night had fully set in. The sun was long gone, and the only light came from the campfire. We were a few beers in, talking about life, shared friends, and every so often circling back to whatever was in the lake. Everything felt fine until we heard a splash coming from the water. All four of us turned at the same time to look out at the pitch-black lake. We assumed it was probably just a fish. We went back to talking, but only for a few seconds before another splash echoed across the water. This time, it did not sound like a small fish breaking the surface. It sounded more like the heavy splashing you would hear if someone was walking through waist-deep water. The girls urged us to go check it out, so Rodney and I grabbed flashlights and walked to the edge of the lake where the noise was coming from. With both lights aimed at the water, we slowly scanned the still surface of the lake. Then Rodney stopped me and asked, "What is that?" I followed the beam of his flashlight. There was something in the water. At first, I thought it was just an object, but then I realized it looked like the head of something. It was definitely not any animal that belonged in a lake. It appeared to be holding its head just above the water, and we could see the reflection of its eyes. It was staring directly at us. Then it moved, lifting itself slightly higher out of the water and causing another loud splash. That was when Rodney and I yelled for the girls to move. I remember Rodney shouting to grab anything important and leave, which turned out to be good advice. I grabbed my valuables and left behind the tent and anything bulky. We ran down the trail back to the parking lot, threw our stuff into the car, and sped away down the parkway. The next day, I returned with my dad to pick up the tents, but everything we left behind was ruined. The tents were torn apart, the coolers were scratched up and tossed around the campsite. I told my dad about what we saw in the lake. I showed him the cut on my ankle and asked what he thought could have caused it. He said he honestly had no idea, and we left quickly. None of us ever went back to that lake again. My house is located next to a nature preserve on Long Island, New York. Most of the time I live by myself, except when my girlfriend visits from another state. Still, I am not truly alone. I have 2 German shepherds named Tate and Moose. They sleep downstairs near the back door. Last week, for 3 nights in a row, I was woken up in the middle of the night by both of them barking at the back door. On the first night, I only looked out through the window in the door, but the yard was completely empty. The second night, I went a step further and walked out onto the patio to check, but again, there was no one around. By the third night of being jolted awake by barking, I convinced myself that someone had to be sneaking around my property every night, setting the dogs off. I clipped Tate onto his leash and took him out into the yard. Strangely, once he was outside, he seemed calmer. He was no longer barking at nothing. I walked him around the backyard and along the tree line near the woods, hoping he would pick up whatever scent had been bothering them for the past 3 nights. That was when he reacted. Near the edge of the woods, Tate began pulling hard on the leash and barking at something hidden among the trees. I could not see very far into the forest since it was nighttime, so I allowed him to guide me forward. If someone really was trespassing, I figured letting my dog chase them off would scare them away. Tate continued dragging me deeper into the woods, barking the whole time. I was getting winded just trying to keep pace with him. He seemed completely focused on something ahead of us. Then suddenly he stopped. Tate quit pulling and barking and stood still, his ears pinned back in a defensive posture. He looked frightened, staring straight ahead at something I could not see. I tried to look into the darkness, but my vision only reached so far. A snapping sound from a stick or small branch ahead confirmed that we were not alone in the woods. That was when I decided to speak up. I shouted that whoever was out there needed to stop trespassing on my property. I warned that if they did not leave, I would either release my dogs or call the police, depending on what I felt was necessary. There was no reply, and no sign that anyone acknowledged what I said. There was another crunch, the sound of a twig or stick being pushed into the ground by something. Once again it confirmed that someone or something was standing roughly 10 yards away. I whistled for Tate to follow me as I turned us around and started back toward the house. Tate kept glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. I had to tug on the leash just to keep us moving forward. Then I heard a footstep directly behind us, and Tate began growling and barking once more. That was the moment I truly felt threatened. I did not have my phone with me. I did not have a flashlight either. The only thing I had to protect me was Tate. Then I heard a sound that I still cannot explain. It was a clicking noise mixed with a low humming sound, almost like something you would expect from a massive insect. Tate completely lost it again. He barked and growled while trying to lunge forward, but I held him back. I kept staring in the direction he was focused on, and then I finally noticed something. There was a pair of glowing eyes, but they were positioned very high above the ground, not low like the eyes of a cat or a raccoon. At that point, I started running back toward my house. I could see the glow from my back patio light shining through the trees. I broke through the tree line and into my backyard. I rushed Tate to the back door and brought him inside. I turned back toward the trees at the far edge of my yard and stood there, completely still. I listened, waiting for any sound. A rustling in the bushes made me turn my head about 20 degrees to the right. That was when I saw it. A figure was standing in the woods near the tree line. The patio light barely illuminated the outline of its body. It appeared to have the shape of something humanoid. It was crouched low, partially hidden behind a small bush. Its arms looked unnaturally long compared to the rest of its body. The lower half of its face was completely dark, almost like a wide open mouth. I kept referring to it as an it because I knew what I was seeing could not be human. I went back inside, closed all the blinds, and brought my dogs upstairs into my bedroom. I called the police and reported an unidentified creature in the preserve. I gave the best description I could over the phone. The woman I spoke with told me to call back if the person or creature actually entered my private property. Calling them was mostly for my own peace of mind, and no officers were sent out. Since that night, I have been having my dogs sleep in my room with me. There have been no more sightings so far. I will update everyone if anything changes. My wife and I have lived in our farmhouse in Chapel Hill, Tennessee, for more than 15 years. For 14 of those years, nothing unusual ever happened. Our children have all grown up and moved away. Now it is just my wife and me living in the house. In February of 2019, strange things began to occur. One night, I was shaken awake by my wife. She told me she had heard a noise outside the bedroom window and wanted me to check it out. I got up, walked over to the window, lifted it, and looked outside. It was cold out, and I did not want to stand there long. I did not see anything, so I closed the window and told my wife everything was fine. I climbed back into bed, but before we could fall asleep again, we both heard another sound. It was a sharp, quick clicking noise right at the window. My wife is not easily frightened, but she grabbed my arm and was clearly nervous. She asked me to take the shotgun and go see who was out there. I told her to calm down and went back to the window to check again. That was when I noticed a small scratch on the glass, coming from the outside. I called my wife over and showed her. She covered her mouth and said, "Oh my." We had no idea what could have caused it. I assumed it had to be some large animal. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the area near the window. There were no footprints in the dirt beside the house. Nothing at all seemed out of place. So we moved on with our lives until the following night. That night was warmer and rainy, which is unusual for February. My wife and I settled back into bed when we heard another noise. This one was loud enough to be heard over the rain. It sounded like scraping. It was muffled since it was coming from outside. The sound seemed to move closer to the window and then suddenly stopped. We both sat up again and looked at each other. She did not even need to ask this time. I reached under the bed for the shotgun, put on my raincoat, and went outside as fast as my aging body would allow. My wife turned on the bedroom light, giving me enough visibility to see deep gouges in the vinyl siding. They looked exactly like claw marks. I looked down at the muddy ground beneath my feet and saw large footprints. They stopped directly below the window and then turned back toward the woods. I examined the prints as best I could while the rain slowly washed them away. They did not look like shoe prints or anything left by an animal I recognized. They looked like massive footprints with claws at the ends. We do not have black bears in this area. In 15 years, we had never seen one. None of it made any sense. Suddenly, I no longer felt safe outside, even with the shotgun, so I rushed back inside. I told my wife that something large was out there, but that we were safe as long as we stayed indoors. We do not have blinds on our bedroom windows since there is no reason for privacy. No one ever comes onto our property. All I could do was tell my wife to try to sleep. The following night is when everything truly became terrifying. I woke up around 3 in the morning. My wife was still asleep. I sat up, thinking I heard something again, and noticed the room felt cold. I looked toward the window and saw it was open. But that was not the first thing I noticed. The first thing I saw was a head leaning through the open window into our bedroom. The best word I can use to describe it isn't human. Based on the size and shape, it was larger than a human head and had a comb-like form. I could not make out facial features because it was too dark, and everything happened so fast. I let out a scream, louder than I have heard myself scream in decades. I reached under the bed for the shotgun, but by the time I grabbed it, whatever was at the window was already gone. My wife screamed in response to my scream. I rushed to the window, slammed it shut, and locked it. I told her we were sleeping in our son's old bedroom that night. Believe it or not, this happened almost a year ago now, and whatever that creature was has never come back. But for 3 nights in a row, it returned to our window, and on the 3rd night, it was halfway inside our bedroom.